The smallest favor you do for a stranger might be the moment your entire future changes. Rain fell steadily over downtown Seattle, turning sidewalks into mirrors of reflected headlights and glowing storefront signs. Most people hurried through the weather with their heads down and their umbrellas angled against the wind. Claire Morgan tightened her coat and adjusted the strap of her bag as she stepped beneath the shelter of a crowded bus stop. It had been a long day at the independent bookstore where she worked, and she still needed to stop by the grocery store before heading home. Her younger sister's college tuition payment was due in 2 weeks, and Claire had spent most of the afternoon calculating expenses in her head. Life seemed to be measured in numbers lately. Rent, utilities, tuition, gas. Every dollar already had a purpose before it even arrived. As another cold gust swept through the street, Claire glanced at the arrival screen mounted near the bus stop. 10 more minutes. She sighed quietly. Around her, strangers scrolled through their phones, listened to music, or stared out into the rain. That was when she noticed him. A man stood several feet away beneath the edge of the shelter. He appeared to be around 40, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans. Nothing about him stood out except the expression on his face. He looked frustrated, not angry, but genuinely stuck. He checked an empty phone screen several times before slipping it back into his pocket. Then he approached 2 different people nearby and seemed to ask a question. Both shook their heads and returned their attention to their own devices. After a moment, he looked around uncertainly. Claire watched the exchange. Normally, she might have ignored it. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had problems. Yet something about the situation felt different. The man did not seem careless or irresponsible. He simply looked lost. Finally, he approached the shelter again and stopped a respectful distance away. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I hate to ask this, but would it be possible to borrow your phone for one quick call? Mine died about 20 minutes ago." Several people immediately avoided eye contact. One person stepped farther away. The man nodded as though he expected the reaction. Claire hesitated. Every warning she had ever heard flashed through her mind. Be careful. Do not trust strangers. Protect yourself. Yet something in his voice sounded sincere. More importantly, he looked embarrassed to even be asking. "Just one call?" she asked. Relief immediately crossed his face. One call. Less than a minute. Claire unlocked her phone and handed it over. "Speaker only." The man smiled. "Fair enough." He dialed a number from memory. A few seconds later, someone answered. "Michael, it is Ethan. My phone died." "Yes, again." He laughed softly. "I know. Listen, I am at the 4th Avenue bus stop. The meeting ended later than expected, and I need the updated address." He listened for several moments before nodding. "Got it. Thank you." Then he ended the call and immediately returned the phone. "You just saved my evening." Claire slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Glad it helped." The man smiled. Most people would not have handed a stranger their phone. Most strangers probably do not ask as politely as you did. He laughed. The sound felt surprisingly genuine. That is probably true. Rain continued tapping against the shelter roof. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the man extended his hand. "Ethan Hayes." Claire shook it. "Claire Morgan." "Thank you, Claire." "You are welcome, Ethan." He glanced toward the street where a black sedan had just pulled to the curb. "That would be my ride." Before leaving, he paused. "You know, kindness is getting harder to find these days." Claire smiled faintly. "I think people are still kind. Most of them are just busy." Ethan studied her answer for a second as though he intended to remember it. Then he nodded. "Maybe you are right." He stepped toward the waiting vehicle before turning back one final time. "I hope something good happens to you this week." Claire laughed. "That would be nice." Ethan smiled and climbed into the car. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared into the rainy traffic. Claire expected that to be the end of the story. Just a brief interaction between 2 strangers on a wet evening. What she did not know was that Ethan Hayes was not an ordinary traveler with a dead phone battery. And Ethan did not yet realize that the woman who had casually handed him her phone in the middle of a storm was about to become someone he would never forget. Claire Morgan forgot about Ethan Hayes for exactly 3 days. Life had a way of pushing everything else aside. The bookstore where she worked was preparing for a weekend author event. Inventory shipments were arriving late, and her younger sister Emma called almost every evening with questions about classes, tuition forms, and campus housing. By Friday afternoon, the rainy encounter at the bus stop felt like nothing more than a pleasant memory. That changed when the front door of Harbor Page's bookstore opened, and a familiar voice said, "I was hoping I would find you here." Claire looked up from a stack of newly arrived books and immediately recognized him. Ethan stood near the entrance carrying a small paper bag. He wore the same simple style of clothing she remembered from the bus stop. Nothing about him suggested wealth, status, or importance. He looked like any ordinary customer visiting a neighborhood bookstore. Claire smiled, surprised. "Your phone charged successfully, I see." Ethan laughed. Eventually, he approached the counter and placed the paper bag in front of her. "I came to repay a debt." Claire looked confused. "For a 30-second phone call? For helping a stranger who had no reason to expect help?" She opened the bag and discovered a box containing pastries from one of the city's most popular bakeries. "You did not have to do this." "Probably not." Ethan smiled. "But I wanted to." Claire shook her head while laughing softly. "This is entirely unnecessary." "Then we agree it is a perfect gift." Before she could respond, a customer approached the register. Claire excused herself and helped process several purchases. By the time she finished, Ethan had wandered toward the history section and appeared genuinely interested in the books. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the store quieted again. Claire noticed Ethan holding a hardcover biography while reading the back cover. "Looking for something specific?" she asked. Ethan glanced up. "Actually, I am just browsing." Dangerous answer in a bookstore. "Why?" "Because browsing turns into buying." Ethan smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like professional advice." Years of experience. To Claire's surprise, Ethan remained in the store for nearly an hour. They spoke between customers about books, travel, favorite authors, and childhood memories. The conversation felt easy, natural. Neither seemed eager for it to end. Eventually, Ethan selected 2 books and carried them to the register. As Claire rang up the purchase, he glanced around the store. "You like working here?" It was not a question. Claire nodded. "Most days. Even when customers ask too many questions? Especially then." Ethan laughed. "You are very patient. That is a skill developed through retail." The answer made him smile again. There was something refreshing about her honesty. She never seemed impressed by appearances, never exaggerated, never tried to become something she was not. Before leaving, Ethan hesitated near the counter. "Can I ask you something?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "That depends. Do you always help strangers?" She considered the question. "Not always." "Then why me?" Claire thought for a moment. "You looked like someone who genuinely needed help." Ethan seemed unusually thoughtful after hearing the answer. "That's simple. Most important things usually are." For a brief second, he looked as though he wanted to say more. Instead, he nodded. "Thank you again, Claire. You already brought pastries." "Still feels insufficient." "Then I guess you will have to live with the guilt." Ethan laughed and headed toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. "I might come back." Claire pretended to think about it. "As long as you buy books." "That seems fair." After he left, Claire found herself smiling for reasons she could not fully explain. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan sat inside the back seat of a vehicle moving through afternoon traffic. His longtime friend and business partner Michael sat beside him reviewing documents on a tablet. "You are smiling," Michael observed. Ethan looked out the window. "Am I? Which means this has something to do with the bookstore." Ethan laughed quietly. "You assume too much. You tracked down a bookstore employee because she let you borrow her phone. I brought pastries. That is not helping your case." Ethan shook his head. Yet as the city passed outside the window, he found himself thinking about Claire again. Not because she knew who he was. She did not. Not because she wanted something from him. She clearly did not. For perhaps the first time in a very long while, someone had treated Ethan Hayes exactly the same way they would treat anyone else. And what neither of them realized was that the simple act of returning a favor had quietly become the beginning of something much larger than either expected. Over the next several weeks, Ethan Hayes became a familiar sight inside Harbor Page's bookstore. At first, Claire assumed his visits were a coincidence. The store sat near several office buildings and a busy downtown district. Plenty of people stopped by regularly. Yet Ethan always seemed to appear at unusual moments. He arrived during quiet afternoons when the store was nearly empty. He wandered through sections most customers ignored. He purchased books he genuinely seemed excited to read. Most surprisingly, he remembered details from previous conversations. One Tuesday afternoon, Claire mentioned that her sister Emma had an important scholarship interview approaching. When Ethan returned several days later, he immediately asked how it had gone. Another time she mentioned a favorite childhood novel, and a week later he appeared carrying a copy he had finally read. The thoughtful consistency caught her attention. One rainy evening, shortly before closing, only a handful of customers remained browsing the shelves. Soft jazz played through the speakers while rain tapped gently against the front windows. Ethan occupied his usual corner near the history section, reviewing notes inside a worn leather notebook Claire had never seen before. It looked old and heavily used, its edges softened by years of travel. Every few minutes, he would jot something down before returning to a book spread open beside him. Claire found herself curious, not because she wanted to invade his privacy, but because the notebook seemed important. It never left his side. Around closing time, a customer requested assistance finding a specific author. Claire spent nearly 20 minutes helping locate several titles in the back storage room. By the time she returned to the sales floor, the final customers had already left. The store was quiet. Chairs were stacked. Lights were dimmed. Ethan was gone. Claire walked through the aisles performing her usual closing routine. She straightened displays, organized misplaced books, and prepared the register for the evening count. As she approached the reading area near the history section, something caught her eye. Resting on a small wooden table sat the leather notebook. Claire immediately recognized it. Ethan must have left without realizing it. She picked it up carefully. The notebook felt surprisingly heavy. For a moment, she considered calling after him, but he was already long gone. She glanced at the cover. No name, no business card, nothing identifying the owner except the obvious fact that it belonged to Ethan. Several possibilities crossed her mind. She could open it and search for contact information. Most people probably would. Instead, she shook her head and smiled. Not my business, she quietly said to herself. The decision felt simple. Whatever was inside belonged to him. Claire carried the notebook to the small office behind the register and locked it inside a desk drawer for safekeeping. The following morning, Ethan realized the notebook was missing almost immediately. He had reached a conference room several miles away when his hand instinctively searched for it. The realization stopped him cold. For a brief moment, genuine concern crossed his face. That notebook contained years of personal observations, business ideas, community project notes, travel reflections, and private thoughts he had never shared with anyone. His assistant noticed the change immediately. "Everything okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "I left something important behind." Yet despite his concern, another thought followed almost instantly. The notebook was at Harbor Pages, and Claire had found it. Strangely, that realization eased his worry. Across town, Claire started her shift as usual. The bookstore filled with customers seeking shelter from another gray Seattle morning. She was helping unpack a shipment of new arrivals when the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside, moving faster than she had ever seen before. The moment their eyes met, he visibly relaxed. Claire laughed. "Let me guess." Ethan smiled. "You found it." She reached beneath the counter and produced the notebook. "Looking for this?" Relief washed across his face. "You have no idea." Claire handed it over. "I figured it might be important." Ethan accepted it carefully. For several seconds, he simply looked at the notebook before meeting her eyes again. "Thank you." "You are welcome." "Did you open it?" Claire immediately shook her head. "No." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Not even a little?" "It is your notebook." For a moment, he said nothing. Then a slow smile appeared. "Most people would have looked." Claire shrugged. "Then most people are more curious than I am." The answer lingered between them. Neither realized it in that moment, but something important had just happened. Claire had unknowingly passed another test of character without even realizing one existed. And as Ethan looked at the notebook he thought he had lost forever, he found himself becoming even more interested in the woman who seemed determined to do the right thing even when nobody was watching. After the notebook incident, something shifted between Claire and Ethan. Neither mentioned it directly, but the trust that had been quietly growing became stronger. Their conversations lasted longer. Their meetings happened more naturally. What began as chance encounters slowly turned into a familiar routine neither seemed eager to change. Every Thursday afternoon, Ethan appeared at Harbor Pages bookstore carrying either a new book recommendation or a question about something he had recently read. Claire began setting aside titles she thought he might enjoy. Sometimes they discussed history. Other times they debated biographies, novels, or ideas about education and community improvement. The subjects changed constantly, but the conversations always seemed to leave both of them smiling. One afternoon, while reorganizing a display near the front window, Claire noticed Ethan studying a bulletin board covered with local event flyers. "Looking for something?" she asked. Ethan pointed toward a flyer advertising a community literacy program. "Have you volunteered with them before?" Claire nodded immediately. "For 3 years. 3 years. Reading workshops, book drives, tutoring sessions. Whatever they need." Ethan looked impressed. "That sounds like a serious commitment." Claire shrugged. "Books changed my life when I was younger. It feels right to help other people discover them." Ethan remained quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "Would they accept another volunteer?" Claire laughed softly. "You? Why not?" "Because most people ask that question and never actually show up." Ethan folded the flyer and slipped it into his pocket. "Maybe I am not most people." The following Saturday morning, Claire arrived at the literacy center expecting a normal volunteer session. To her surprise, Ethan was already there helping arrange tables before the first students arrived. He wore simple clothes, carried boxes of donated books, and worked alongside everyone else without drawing attention to himself. Throughout the day, Claire observed something she found increasingly difficult to ignore. Ethan genuinely enjoyed helping people. He listened carefully when children spoke. He encouraged nervous readers. He spent nearly 20 minutes helping one teenager find books related to engineering after learning about the student's career interests. Nothing about his behavior felt performative. Nobody seemed to know him. Nobody treated him differently. Yet he gave every person his complete attention. On the drive home that evening, Claire found herself thinking about him again. The feeling had become familiar enough to stop surprising her. What surprised her instead was how easy everything felt when they were together. There were no games. No exaggerated stories. No attempts to impress one another. Just conversations, laughter, and a growing sense of comfort. Several days later, Ethan stopped by the bookstore carrying coffee for both of them. Claire accepted the cup with a smile. "You are becoming predictable." Ethan laughed. "I thought consistency was a positive quality." "Depends." "On what?" "Whether you are bringing coffee." The answer made him laugh again. As they spoke, Claire mentioned that her younger sister Emma would graduate college the following year if everything stayed on track financially. Pride immediately brightened her expression. "She has worked incredibly hard," Claire said. "So have you," Ethan replied. Claire looked surprised. "What makes you say that?" Ethan gestured toward the bookstore around them. "You work full-time. You volunteer. You help support your sister. Most people would be overwhelmed." Claire looked away briefly. "Some things are worth being tired for." Ethan memorized the sentence instantly. Later that evening, after the bookstore closed, Claire received a call from Emma. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Tuition costs were increasing again. Additional fees had appeared unexpectedly. By the time the call ended, Claire sat alone in her apartment staring at a list of expenses. She would find a solution. She always did. Yet the numbers felt heavier than usual. What she did not know was that across the city, Ethan sat in a conference room overlooking Seattle's skyline while reviewing proposals connected to educational funding initiatives. Senior executives discussed budgets measured in millions of dollars. Community grants, scholarship programs, regional partnerships. Ethan listened quietly before asking several questions about student support programs. Nobody in the room realized why the topic suddenly interested him so much. As the meeting ended, Ethan opened his notebook and wrote a brief observation near the bottom of the page. Some people build their future by helping someone else reach theirs first. Then he closed the notebook and looked out at the city lights below. The connection he felt toward Claire had grown far beyond simple curiosity. Yet she still knew almost nothing about the world he came from. And hidden behind every ordinary conversation, every volunteer event, and every afternoon spent discussing books, a secret waited patiently in the background. A secret that would soon transform everything they believed about each other. What Claire Morgan did not know was that while their friendship continued growing through bookstores, volunteer programs, and quiet conversations, Ethan Hayes lived in a completely different world whenever he disappeared at the end of the day. On a crisp Monday morning, while Claire unlocked harbor pages and prepared shelves for customers, Ethan arrived at a 40-story glass tower overlooking downtown Seattle. The lobby alone was larger than the entire bookstore. Executives moved through the building carrying reports and presentation materials. Assistants coordinated meetings. Investors waited in conference rooms. And as Ethan entered the executive floor, dozens of people greeted him with the respect reserved for someone whose decisions influenced thousands of lives. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," his assistant said as she handed him a tablet filled with schedules and financial summaries. Ethan nodded and continued toward the boardroom. Moments later, he sat at the head of a long conference table surrounded by senior leaders from Hayes Technologies, the company he founded more than 15 years earlier. Revenue reports appeared on massive screens. Expansion plans covered hundreds of pages. New partnerships involved investments worth millions of dollars. Yet despite the scale of the discussions, Ethan's attention repeatedly drifted toward a different topic entirely. Community education initiatives, literacy programs, scholarship opportunities. "The educational grant proposal requires final approval," one executive explained. Ethan reviewed the document carefully. The program would support students throughout the Pacific Northwest. The proposal received unanimous support. "Approved," Ethan said. Several people around the table nodded. None of them realized he was thinking about Claire's sister while making the decision. Later that afternoon, Ethan met with his longtime friend and business partner, Michael Turner. Michael had known Ethan for over a decade and recognized when something occupied his thoughts. "You are spending more time around bookstores than boardrooms lately," Michael said with a grin. Ethan laughed. "That is an exaggeration." "Not by much." Michael leaned back in his chair. "So when are you planning to tell her?" Ethan immediately knew who he meant. "Tell her what?" "That you own this company." Ethan looked out the office window toward the city skyline. "I do not know." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That answer usually means you are avoiding the question." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe." The truth was more complicated than he wanted to admit. Every day he delayed telling Claire, the conversation became harder. Yet every day he spent time with her reinforced why he had remained silent in the first place. Claire treated him like a normal person. She challenged his opinions, laughed at his jokes, recommended books, discussed family concerns. She cared about who he was, not what he owned. Across the city, Claire remained completely unaware of the discussion taking place. Her afternoon passed helping customers, organizing inventory, and preparing for an upcoming literacy fundraiser. Around closing time, she received exciting news. Emma called sounding breathless with excitement. "I made the final round," her sister announced. "For the scholarship?" Claire asked. "Yes." Relief flooded through her immediately. The scholarship could dramatically reduce future tuition expenses. "That is amazing." "I still have one more interview," Emma said. "But this is the closest I have ever gotten." After the call ended, Claire sat quietly behind the counter smiling. Ethan happened to arrive a few minutes later. One glance at her expression told him something good had happened. "Okay," he said. "What is the good news?" Claire laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "Very." She explained the scholarship update. Ethan listened carefully, genuinely pleased. "That is fantastic. She has worked incredibly hard." "I believe it." Claire noticed the sincerity in his voice. "You sound personally invested." Ethan smiled. "I think education changes lives." The answer felt simple enough. Yet hidden behind it was a truth Claire could not yet see. Ethan's company funded dozens of educational programs throughout the region. Some of them would soon become unexpectedly important to her family. A few days later, while preparing materials for the literacy fundraiser, Claire encountered another small clue she failed to recognize. Several event organizers discussed a major corporate sponsor supporting community education efforts. One volunteer mentioned the name Hayes Technologies. The company sounded vaguely familiar, but Claire paid little attention. Corporate names appeared on sponsorship banners all the time. Meanwhile, Ethan stood less than 10 miles away reviewing final details for a public education summit scheduled the following month. Hundreds of educators, nonprofit leaders, business executives, and scholarship recipients would attend. As founder and chief executive officer, Ethan would deliver the keynote address. The event had been planned for nearly a year. What he did not realize was that Claire would soon receive an invitation to attend. And when that day arrived, the carefully separated worlds he had managed to keep apart would finally collide in a way neither of them could possibly avoid. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in an envelope Claire almost threw away by mistake. Harbor Page's bookstore received dozens of flyers, promotional materials, and event announcements every week. Most of them ended up stacked in a corner for later review. Claire was sorting through the mail during a quiet moment when she noticed a letter addressed specifically to the bookstore's literacy outreach coordinator. Since she handled most of the volunteer programs, she opened it immediately. Inside was an invitation to attend the Northwest Education Summit, one of the largest educational development events in the region. The letter recognized Harbor Pages for its continued support of community literacy programs and offered complimentary admission for 2 representatives. Claire smiled. The recognition felt meaningful. Their small bookstore rarely received invitations to events of this scale. That evening she called Emma. "Do you want to come with me?" she asked. Her sister practically shouted through the phone. "Absolutely." A week later, they arrived at the summit together. The event occupied a massive convention center overlooking Seattle's waterfront. Thousands of attendees filled the building. Educators, nonprofit leaders, scholarship recipients, volunteers, business sponsors, and community advocates moved between presentations and exhibits. Claire immediately felt out of place among so many professionals. Emma, however, was fascinated. "This is incredible," she whispered while looking around. "I know," Claire laughed. "I think we both underestimated this event." Throughout the morning, they attended workshops and panel discussions focused on literacy, scholarships, and educational access. Several presentations highlighted programs Claire already recognized from her volunteer work. More than once she noticed the name Hayes Technologies appearing on banners, screens, and printed materials. Each time, the company seemed connected to another educational initiative. "Whoever runs this company really cares about education," Emma commented. Claire nodded absent-mindedly. She still had no reason to connect the name with Ethan. Shortly after lunch, attendees began moving toward the main auditorium for the keynote presentation. Hundreds of people filled rows of seats beneath enormous screens. The atmosphere felt different now, more formal, more important. Claire and Emma found seats halfway down the center aisle. "This speaker must be a big deal," Emma whispered after noticing the excitement around them. Before Claire could answer, the lights dimmed. A presenter stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the afternoon session. The audience applauded politely. Then the introduction began. Today's keynote speaker has spent more than 15 years transforming technology, innovation, and educational access throughout the Pacific Northwest. Through his leadership, millions of dollars have been invested into scholarship programs, literacy initiatives, and community development efforts that continue changing lives every day. Claire listened casually at first. Then the large screen behind the stage illuminated with photographs. Corporate headquarters, community projects, business awards, media interviews. Something about the face appearing across the screen seemed strangely familiar. Her heart skipped. "No, that was impossible." The presenter continued. "Please join me in welcoming founder, Chief Executive Officer, and philanthropist Ethan Hayes." The auditorium erupted into applause. Hundreds of people stood to their feet. Claire froze. Emma gasped beside her. For a moment, the entire room seemed to disappear. Ethan walked onto the stage wearing a tailored suit. The same Ethan who spent afternoons discussing books. The same Ethan who volunteered at literacy programs. The same Ethan who carried an old notebook and bought coffee during bookstore visits. Except now he stood before thousands of people as one of the most influential business leaders in the region. Claire could barely process what she was seeing. Every unexplained detail suddenly made sense. The vague descriptions of his work, the business calls, the educational programs, the corporate sponsorships, the way people seemed to know him at community events. The truth connected itself all at once. Beside her, Emma stared at the stage in disbelief. "Claire," she whispered, "that is Ethan." Claire could only nod. On stage, Ethan began speaking. His voice sounded exactly the same. Calm, thoughtful, familiar. Yet everything felt different now. He spoke about education, opportunity, community investment, and the importance of helping people build better futures. The audience listened attentively. Claire heard the words, but her thoughts remained trapped elsewhere. "He never told me." The realization repeated itself again and again. Not because she cared about his money. Not because she cared about his company. Because she cared about honesty. Throughout the speech, Ethan occasionally scanned the audience. Then, halfway through a story about community literacy programs, his eyes found Claire. For a brief second, his expression changed. Surprise, concern, understanding. He immediately knew what had happened. He knew she had discovered the truth. The rest of the presentation passed in a blur. When the audience rose for another standing ovation, Claire remained seated. Her emotions tangled together in confusion. Admiration, shock, disappointment, questions she did not know how to ask. As soon as the session ended, people rushed toward the stage hoping to meet Ethan. Claire quietly stood. "Do you want to talk to him?" Emma asked. Claire looked toward the crowd gathering around the man she thought she knew. Then she slowly shook her head. "Not right now." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Ethan excused himself from executives and reporters as quickly as possible. Because for the first time since they met, the person he wanted to speak with most was already walking away. The drive home from the education summit was one of the longest Claire Morgan could remember. Rain streaked across the windshield while Seattle traffic crawled through the evening. Beside her, Emma occasionally glanced over as if trying to decide whether to speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "Are you okay?" Claire stared through the passenger window. "I do not know." Emma nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The truth was difficult to explain. Claire was not upset because Ethan was wealthy. She was not angry because he had built a successful company. In many ways, she admired everything he had accomplished. What unsettled her was the realization that an entire part of his life had remained hidden. Every conversation replayed inside her mind. Every vague answer. Every time he described his work without actually describing it. Every opportunity, he had to tell her the truth. By the time Claire reached her apartment, her phone contained 3 missed calls from Ethan and 2 text messages. The first simply said, "I would like to explain." The second arrived an hour later. "Please let me know when you are ready to talk." Claire stared at the screen before placing the phone face down on the table. She was not ready. The next morning, Harbor Page's bookstore opened as usual. Customers browsed shelves. Deliveries arrived. Life continued. Yet Claire felt distracted. Around noon, the front door opened and Ethan stepped inside. The moment she saw him, her stomach tightened. He looked tired, as though he had slept very little. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ethan slowly approached the counter. "Can we talk?" Claire folded her arms. "About which part?" The question landed harder than she intended. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "All of it." Claire glanced toward the nearly empty store. "I have 10 minutes." They moved to a quiet reading area near the back. Rain tapped softly against the windows while silence settled between them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I should have told you sooner." Claire nodded. "Yes." There was no argument in her voice. Just honesty. Somehow that felt worse. Ethan took a breath. "I never intended to deceive you." "Then why did you?" He looked away. "Because the moment people learn who I am, everything changes." Claire laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because she suddenly understood how many times he must have repeated that explanation in his own mind. "You did not give me the chance to prove you wrong." Ethan fell silent. Claire continued. "You decided for me." The words hung heavily between them. Ethan had no answer because she was right. "I like talking to you," Claire said quietly. "I like spending time with you. I trusted you." Ethan's expression tightened. Everything we shared was real. "I know it was." That admission surprised both of them. Claire looked down at her hands. "That is what makes this so difficult." Because despite everything, she knew the conversations had been real. The bookstore visits had been real. The volunteer work had been real. The laughter had been real. Yet the secret remained standing between them. After several moments, Claire stood. "I need time." Ethan nodded immediately. "I understand." "Do you?" she asked. "Because right now I feel like I only knew half of you." Ethan looked at her with genuine regret. "Then take whatever time you need." Unlike many people, he did not argue. He did not pressure her. He did not try to force forgiveness. That somehow made the situation harder. Over the following weeks, Claire created distance. She remained polite whenever Ethan visited the bookstore, but their conversations became brief. The easy comfort they once shared disappeared. At literacy events, they found themselves standing on opposite sides of the room. Friends and volunteers noticed the change, though nobody understood the reason. Ethan respected every boundary she established. He never used his position, never used his influence, never asked anyone to intervene. Instead, he quietly stepped back and allowed her the space she requested. Yet even from a distance, Claire continued hearing stories about him. New scholarship programs launched across the region. Community libraries received additional funding. Educational partnerships expanded. What struck her most was how little publicity accompanied these efforts. The announcements focused on students, teachers, and communities rather than executives or corporations. More than once, Claire learned about a new program only after someone else mentioned it. Ethan never brought them up himself. As winter approached, Claire found herself facing an uncomfortable truth. The man she met at the bus stop and the man standing on that conference stage were not two different people. They were the same person, the same kindness, the same patience, the same attention to others, the same willingness to help without expecting recognition. The wealth had shocked her. The secrecy had hurt her. But neither changed the character she had witnessed from the beginning. And slowly, despite her efforts to maintain distance, she began wondering whether the person she missed was not the millionaire she had discovered at the summit. Perhaps it was simply the man who once needed to borrow a phone on a rainy evening and somehow ended up changing her life. Winter settled over Seattle with cold mornings, early sunsets, and the quiet rhythm that arrives when people spend more time indoors. Nearly 2 months had passed since the education summit. Claire and Ethan still saw each other occasionally through community programs and literacy events, but the easy connection they once shared remained fractured. They were polite, respectful, careful, yet both knew something important had been lost. Ethan never pushed. He never asked mutual friends for updates. He never appeared unexpectedly at Claire's apartment or tried to force conversations she was not ready to have. Instead, he focused his energy elsewhere. One snowy Saturday morning, Claire arrived at a community literacy center where volunteers were preparing for a large winter reading initiative. Hundreds of children from local schools would receive books before the holiday season. The event had become one of Claire's favorite annual traditions. As she entered the building carrying donated materials, she noticed several new displays along the walls. Reading stations, study areas, technology resources. The center looked dramatically different than it had only months earlier. "Everything looks amazing," Claire told the program director. The woman smiled. "We finally received the funding to complete the expansion." Claire nodded. "That must have been a huge project." "It was." The director glanced around proudly. "Someone believed in what we were trying to build." Claire did not ask who. She already suspected the answer. Throughout the day, volunteers helped families select books, register for tutoring programs, and explore educational resources. The event remained busy from morning until late afternoon. Claire spent hours assisting children in choosing books they could take home. Watching their excitement reminded her why she loved literacy work so much. Near evening, while carrying a stack of boxes toward a storage room, she passed a side entrance and unexpectedly stopped. Outside, snow drifted gently through the air. Several volunteers unloaded supplies from a delivery truck. Among them was Ethan. He wore a simple winter coat, gloves, and a knit cap. No cameras, no publicity, no executives, no announcements. Just Ethan carrying heavy boxes alongside everyone else. Claire watched quietly from inside the doorway. For nearly an hour, she observed him helping wherever needed. He organized donations, moved equipment, assisted volunteers, encouraged students. Most people around him appeared completely unaware that he was one of the wealthiest people in the region. What struck Claire most was how familiar the scene felt. This was the Ethan she met at the bus stop. The Ethan who discussed books. The Ethan who volunteered without seeking recognition. Nothing about his behavior changed when nobody important was watching. Later that evening, after most families had gone home, Claire helped clean up remaining materials. While stacking chairs in the main room, she overheard 2 staff members discussing recent improvements. "The scholarship fund expanded again this year," one said. "Really?" the other replied. "Almost doubled. That will help so many students." Claire listened quietly. "The donor requested complete anonymity," the first staff member added. "No public credit at all." Claire looked down at the chair she was holding. Once again, she already knew. A few days later, Emma called with exciting news. "You are never going to believe this," she said. "What happened?" Claire asked. "I received the scholarship." Claire nearly dropped her phone. Relief flooded through her instantly. The award would eliminate a huge portion of Emma's remaining financial burden. "That is incredible. There is more." Emma sounded stunned. The scholarship fund increased this year. Apparently, additional students were selected because new funding became available. Claire closed her eyes. The timing felt impossible to ignore. Yet Ethan had never mentioned it. Never used it as a reason she should forgive him. never suggested she owed him anything. That realization stayed with her for days. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Claire remained late at the literacy center helping prepare materials for an upcoming program. Most volunteers had already left. Snow covered the streets outside. The building sat quiet beneath soft yellow lights. As Claire organized books near a reading corner, she noticed something resting on a nearby table. A familiar leather notebook. Ethan's notebook. She picked it up carefully, smiling despite herself. A few moments later, footsteps approached. Ethan entered the room and immediately noticed the notebook in her hands. For a second, both laughed. Again, Claire asked. Ethan shook his head. Apparently, I never learn. She handed it back. Their fingers briefly touched. Neither pulled away immediately. Silence settled around them. Not uncomfortable silence. Familiar silence. The kind they once shared often. Finally, Claire looked at him. You really never stopped helping people, did you? Ethan seemed surprised by the question. No. Claire nodded slowly. For the first time since the summit, the disappointment she carried felt lighter. Because standing there in the quiet literacy center, she realized something important. Ethan's secret had hurt her, but his character had never changed. And perhaps the man she trusted had been there all along, waiting patiently for her to see him again. Spring arrived in Seattle almost exactly 1 year after Claire Morgan handed her phone to a stranger standing in the rain at a crowded bus stop. The city felt different now. Trees along downtown streets carried fresh green leaves. Outdoor cafes filled with people enjoying warmer afternoons. And somewhere between winter and spring, something else had quietly changed as well. The distance between Claire and Ethan had begun to disappear. It did not happen all at once. There was no dramatic speech. No grand gesture demanding immediate forgiveness. Instead, there were conversations. Honest conversations. The kind both of them should have had months earlier. Ethan answered every question Claire asked. He spoke openly about his company, his responsibilities, and the reasons he had hidden his identity in the beginning. Claire listened. Sometimes she agreed. Sometimes she challenged him. But little by little, trust returned. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited Claire to visit a new literacy and education center opening on the south side of the city. When they arrived, Claire immediately recognized several organizations she had volunteered with over the years. The building itself was beautiful. Reading rooms, study spaces, technology labs, community classrooms. Everything had been designed to help students and families access educational opportunities. Children ran excitedly through the halls while parents spoke with counselors and volunteers. Claire looked around in amazement. This is incredible. Ethan smiled. I was hoping you would like it. As they toured the center, Claire noticed something familiar displayed near the entrance. A large wall highlighted community partners who had contributed to the project. Yet instead of focusing on companies or executives, the display featured stories from volunteers, teachers, students, and local residents. Ordinary people whose efforts made the project possible. Claire stopped and read several of the stories. You did this on purpose, she said. Ethan nodded. The people doing the work deserve the attention. Claire smiled. That answer sounded exactly like him. Later that afternoon, the center hosted its official dedication ceremony. Hundreds of guests filled the main auditorium. Students, educators, volunteers, donors, and community leaders gathered together to celebrate the opening. Claire sat beside Emma near the front while Ethan prepared backstage. I still cannot believe this is real, Emma whispered. Neither can I. As the ceremony began, speakers shared stories about education, opportunity, and community investment. Finally, Ethan walked onto the stage. Applause filled the room. Yet this time, Claire saw something different when she looked at him. She no longer saw two separate people. She no longer saw the millionaire on one side and the man from the bookstore on the other. She simply saw Ethan, the person she had come to know from the beginning. During his remarks, Ethan spoke about literacy, mentorship, and the importance of small acts of kindness. Then he paused unexpectedly. There is someone here today who taught me a lesson I will never forget. Claire felt her heart begin to race. Ethan smiled as he looked toward her. A year ago, my phone battery died in the middle of a rainstorm. I was lost, frustrated, and trying to make a single phone call. Most people walked past. One person stopped. Soft laughter spread through the audience. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed something small. That moment changed more than I realized. He held up a framed image. Curious murmurs filled the room. Then the large screen behind him displayed the picture. Claire immediately recognized it. A screenshot of her phone number. The very first number she had allowed him to call from her phone on that rainy evening. The audience smiled as Ethan continued. I saved this because I never wanted to forget where everything started. Claire covered her mouth, fighting back tears. Ethan stepped down from the stage and slowly walked toward her. The room fell silent. He stopped directly in front of her chair. Then he opened his notebook. The same notebook she had protected. The same notebook he had forgotten twice. Inside, attached carefully to one page, was a small note written in his handwriting. He looked directly into her eyes. The most important connection I ever made began with one act of kindness. Then he reached into his pocket and removed a ring box. Audible gasps spread throughout the auditorium. Emma immediately began crying. Ethan smiled. Claire Morgan, you helped a stranger make a phone call. You helped a volunteer believe in people again. You helped a businessman remember what success is actually for. Most importantly, you helped me find the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. He opened the ring box. Will you marry me? Through tears and laughter, Claire nodded before he even finished speaking. Yes. The room erupted into applause as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. Months later, surrounded by family, friends, students, volunteers, and neighbors whose lives had become connected through the Literacy Center, they celebrated their wedding beneath a clear summer sky. And among all the photographs taken that day, their favorite was not from the ceremony. It was a picture of an old notebook opened to its final page. On that page, written beneath dozens of ideas and memories, was a single sentence. She thought she was lending a phone to a stranger. She was actually calling me toward the future I had been searching for all along.